Thank you for joining us on the Living Room Disciple podcast. We are incredibly excited to introduce to you Bill Adams, a longtime friend and mentor of mine, who's also a senior representative for Bridges for Peace, an organization that aims to bridge the gap between the church and the nation of Israel. Today, in our conversation, we are going to discuss how we as Christians should relate to the nation of Israel and how, if we don't, we can be formed more or less like Christ. Please excuse me and the road noise and the birds that you hear chirping. I am recording outside today, so that way I don't wake up my children who are still sleeping. And thank you for joining us on the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home. Welcome to the Living Room Disciple podcast. I am incredibly excited to introduce all of you to a good friend and mentor of mine, Mr. Bill Adams. Bill, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Phil. I appreciate the invitation.
One of the things that, so Bill has been investing in and mentoring me for 3, 4, 5 years now, something like that. And in reflecting on and inviting you to the podcast, I think one of the things that was interesting to me is one of the things that's probably most vital in your life that is most defining for both your at least recently ministry career is one of the things that we have not really talked all that much about, and I really haven't shown a lot of curiosity about, and that is the nation of Israel, and where we as believers relate to the nation of Israel. And that's because, for me, it's just been a bit of a quagmire. Like, I don't really know what I believe. I don't really know what to believe. And I haven't invested a lot of thought into it. And so I'm excited to do that this morning. I'm very curious. But before we do, I know why I would consider you, in many ways, a subject matter expert on Christians relating to the nation of Israel, but obviously our listeners don't. So tell us a little bit, Bill, about what you do with an organization called Bridges for Peace.
Thank you, Phil. I will. I serve now as a guy that's called a senior national representative, and somehow that word senior in there makes me sound either knowledgeable or old. It might be a little bit of both.
But, it could be both.
Yeah. I formerly was the deputy U.S. director, but I stepped aside letting Next Generation lead on, and I'm more of a spokesman now. So think of me as a national spokesperson for this work. This work is over 55 years, headquartered in Jerusalem. So I've gotten over there to Israel many, many times. Thought we were going to live there at one point. Lizzie and I, thought we would be. But God had a different plan, that I would work in this country to do a lot of bridge building between the Jewish and Christian worlds. And that's what Bridges for Peace exists for, is building relationships that essentially are not there historically. We have huge gaps of understanding, and we don't relate very well. So I've just been one of these guys that attempts to step across that divide and relate, and thereby communicate truth one to another. There's things to learn from every community, and particularly the Jewish people who share the same root of faith, back to Abraham, that we do. So that's been a real thrilling ride, and not without its bumps in the roads, but I get to do that, and it has to do with teaching Christians the Jewish root of our faith, the real story of the nation of Israel, and among the Jews, get to show them who Jesus really is in the life that we live, and get to answer their questions that they don't know who to ask otherwise, and the conversations really get started. So that's something of my work with Bridges for Peace.
So I'm really glad you started there, because, even as you were kind of explaining the last part, right, where you bridge the gap, there's that evangelical side of me that is like, explain to the nation of Israel, to Jewish peoples, who Jesus really is. I'm totally down for that. Right? That sounds so good. But when you start saying, like, bridge the gap and help Christians understand the real story of Israel, help me explain that a little bit more to me. What do you mean by that? Are you talking about just helping me understand the Old Testament, right? And understand the Old Testament story of Israel? Is there more to it? And I think this is, my intuition tells me this is one of the areas in which, you referred to Christians and Jews have not historically seen eye to eye or gotten along or had much of a bridge built between the two religions. I'm assuming this is one of the areas of disjoint.
Hmm. You mentioned the Old Testament, and you're referring to the Bible that Jesus
Mm-hmm.
read. The Bible the apostles used when they taught us what we now have called the New
Mm-hmm.
Testament. They were all Jews. They were still speaking Jewish. They were speaking Hebrew, and not
Mm-hmm.
only in and Aramaic and Koine Greek, because they could speak it all. And they wrote it in Koine Greek because that was the lingua franca of the time. You were getting the word out through the language of the day, which would be very much like English today. Okay, so but the thinking is still, if you will, Old Testament. The thinking is the same. It's the worldview of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the worldview of what we today call Jewish. So see that the New Testament is just as Jewish as the Old Testament. So it's never one or the other. It's both. And I
Mm-hmm.
actually major in the New Testament. I love to examine in the New Testament what is Hebraic or Jewish rooted, and it's really all of it. And over the centuries, the church departed from that in many ways. You can just track the history of the church. The new Gentile forms of thinking, Greco-Roman thinking, just it's the thinking of the day. It's bound to
Mm-hmm.
prevail, but there was always the need that a remnant was running along, holding on to actual what today we would really call biblical. Biblical is Hebraic. Biblical is not Greco-Roman, and there you go. So, Bridges for Peace, I hope, and my work is just helping to contribute, reconnect for the Christian that we have that worldview, and it does change the outcome of some of your actions, at least, to have that worldview.
And that's where I want to get to. But before we get to the actions, because that's kind of our focus here, right? To think about in this case, how does my theology or doctrine around the nation of Israel, how is that forming me to be more or less like Christ? And for me, as I'm reflecting on this now, really in this moment, I'm thinking to myself, well, I just want to have the same theology and doctrine that Christ had, right? That Jesus himself had when looking at the nation of Israel. I don't think I know what that is. Um, but before we even get there, tell me a little bit about, because I'm only passingly familiar. What are the primary lines of thought, lines of thinking in the Christian church related to Israel? I mean, as Christians do, we tend to be pretty divided on things, and so I'm
Uh-huh.
assuming there's not a primary. Not all Christians think the same thing as it pertains to Israel.
Can you believe it, Phil, that not
I
all
know.
Christians think the
I'm
same thing?
shocked.
In fact,
Yeah.
Israel is, if you can just ignore Israel completely if you try, and then that's maybe the easiest. You know what I'm saying? Just ignore, and we don't
That's what
have
I've
to.
been trying to do. That's
And
what I've been doing. But it feels wrong now. I feel like
right.
maybe I was being immature and childish, and I'm ready to move beyond.
Early on in all this, I actually wrote an article published by Bridges for Peace called Israel Through Four Lenses. And the first one is ignore. Just ignore Israel, and you're kind of like your troubles go away. You don't have to wrestle with this. Now, here's what Paul said: Do not be ignorant, brethren. Do not ignore
Mm,
this mystery. This is Romans 11:25. He warns about
mm,
Christians, believers, being ignorant of what he calls a mystery. So right away, when a mystery means, oh, there's something to be searched out here. There's
yeah.
something going on with Israel that is maybe not right in your face. You have to search it out. But see, a mystery is not a secret. Sometimes that word is some loose Bible translators have called it a secret. No, God's not keeping secrets. He's revealing truth, and it's not that hard to find. It's really the whole Bible. Except Christians have derived that maybe, and some of them are sure that God is done with Israel. And I appreciate you calling it the nation of Israel because the nation is a people. And you really can't deny that he formed a nation through
Mm,
Abraham, covenanted. people, renewed covenant through Isaac, renewed covenant through Jacob. And the 12 sons are the 12 tribes. And through it comes a promise, first a law covenant through Moses. And that's where we tend to get hung up, by the way, because remember, we've already established covenant through Abraham. Now we have a law covenant.
Yeah.
Then we have a Davidic covenant. We have a promise of the king forever through David. He is generally, by all Christians and Jews, understood to be the Messiah. That's the word that we call, that's the name we call Christ through the Greek,
Mm-hmm.
Messiah through the Hebrew. And so you end up with a Messiah. Almost all Christians, we should agree that Jesus is the one. He,
Yes.
he
Yeah.
fulfills he fulfills the covenant. Fulfill then sometimes means to some people ended. We're
That
done with the
and
Abrahamic covenant.
I would say that's my natural inclination
Uh-huh.
right
Fulfilled is
there.
hardly
Right.
ever used that word. It's like when you met Brittany, you became fulfilled. Oh, it
Mm.
ended. Your love ended. There's no you didn't no, you became full is what you
Mm.
did. The hope and the dream and the promise became fulfilled. It didn't end anything. It began the wondrous fullness. Okay. So Jesus, here's the dividing point though. Did Jesus end all of God's plan for the nation Israel, including the Abrahamic covenant, making a distinct people and land? By the way, you never get away from people and land when you talk nation
Mm.
of Israel. And we won't have time to go into it, Phil, but the discussion in Hebrews and the testimony of all the New Testament is that God changed the law. Remember, where did the law? That was one of the covenants along the way. The Mosaic
Mm-hmm.
shifted. It had to shift because there wasn't going to be a temple. You cannot keep Mosaic law without a functioning temple. The vast majority of
Yeah.
Mosaic law is how do you run the temple and sacrifice. Well, see, Jesus fulfilled it all. But the question now for Christians is, does that mean he wiped out the promises God made to the nation Israel for a land and a people to always be before God, and it would be for his purpose? And there I find the very strong answer, a resounding, a shouting, oh, no, he didn't. He's not done with Israel. And I'm just echoing Paul when I say that. And I
Yeah.
study for everybody tuning in, Romans 9, 10, and 11. You don't get any more thoroughly developed theological treatment of any topic than Israel's standing before God, than and any other topic. That's the thing. In the passages where Paul says this is a mystery, he is explaining it more thoroughly, more fully than any other topic I can find as a single topic, other than the overall gospel of Jesus Christ, which is what we proclaim is the only hope and way
Yeah.
for mankind and salvation. Here's my last point on this, and I'll stop, Phil. It's just that God chose a nation, Israel, to bring it all through. Jesus said salvation is of the Jews. The promises, the covenants, the land, the people have all been a vehicle for the coming of this gospel. The only question is it still? And Christians divide over that.
And to build off that, for the record, thank you. I think that's a really good kind of synopsis of where we're at. It's so funny, we are going through the book of Romans in the home church that I have the opportunity to pastor, and we just finished 12, right? So 9, 10, and 11 are still pretty fresh in my brain, and you're right. Although I absolutely, maybe for right or wrong, I don't know, taught this idea of mystery as something we're not going to fully understand, and maybe I was wrong in that. So I need to take some time to reflect on that.
Well, I'm going to quickly
But
agree that fully is a key word. We don't
okay.
fully understand any mystery. How about Father, Son, and Spirit are one?
That was the
Okay,
example I used.
okay. We know the truth, and we live by
Mm,
this truth, and the truth will
okay.
set us free, but we don't fully understand it. And that's
Hmm.
not enough for some people, is it, Phil? We can't explain it enough for some people, so they just reject it, right? It's similar with Israel.
Yeah.
You can't fully explain God's choosing of a people and how he deals with the other people in relation to them. You can't fully explain it, so we might just reject it.
Or I would say, not even necessarily reject it. there's this type of theology that I'm familiar with. I was kind of taught it at one point in my life called substitution theology, which would be the theology that we haven't rejected these things, but the church is now, and I think there's some good biblical evidence for this, right? Like, I am a descendant of Abraham by faith. That's what Paul would write. And so I'm now grafted in, right, to the vine. It's
Romans
both an
11
analogy for
again.
Jesus and Romans 11. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. It's you have a tail end of the Gospel of John. You have Romans 11. So when we bring some of these images together, there's a Christian theology that said, no, it's not that these things have been wiped out, but they're now transferred from the nation of Israel to which people are born into through a bloodline, and now we understand that the descendancy comes through faith, and it's a faith-based descendancy, and so these promises continue on, and they're for Christians today. And I think there's other issues with that
Mm-hmm.
potentially. I don't adhere to that theology, but I'd love to hear you
Yeah.
respond to someone who might be listening and saying, well, that's what I've heard.
Yeah.
That's what I've been taught.
You may not adhere to it, but I'll guarantee you're influenced by it in a passive way. It's been the passive message of the church. And I'm not down on the church. I'm a church man, okay? Longtime pastor, and then missions, and still serving pastorally, serve our church. So don't hear me down on the church. It's because I'm bringing that up. It's like there's an either or paradigm here. It's either the church or it's Israel. Who made me had to choose? It's
Mm.
either Israel is in God's plan, or
I'm
is
going to
oh
pause
yeah,
you just for a second.
sure.
I think what you just said was really, really good.
Hmm.
And you kind of, it was kind of an aside, but I want to draw it out. The question being, who made me choose?
Hmm.
And I think that's a really good one. So
Yeah.
as you keep going, I want to just pause and reflect, like, why do I feel, Bill, like there is a choice that I've got to make between the nation of Israel
Yeah.
and the church? I don't know.
For what it's worth, Phil, I'll put a plug in for a book that I'm a contributor to. It's an anthology by Bridges for Peace authors. But do you see can you read the title okay?
Uh, Israel and the church?
So what's the most important operative word in that little phrase? The
And?
word and. See, Israel and the church. We've grown up on a paradigm of is it Israel or the church? Make your choice. And how
Mm.
could you not choose the church if you're a Christian, for heaven's sakes? And so we've kind of learned, like, be done with
Yeah.
Israel. Israel is a distraction. In fact, the best argument I've ever heard against what I'm promoting was from a young man who said, yeah, and by the way, the term replacement theology is often used.
Mm-hmm.
Supersessionism is a good
Mm-hmm.
theological seminary word that's used. It means
Yeah.
that God didn't just graft in Gentiles into a Jewish root, and that is Romans 11. It's pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
But he actually replaced that Jewish root with the new olive tree that would be the Gentiles. So see, immediately by saying that, I'm contradicting Scripture. But you see where the paradigm comes from. God can't be dealing still with an Israel when He has a church, but He made the church out of an
Yeah.
Israel by grafting against nature, by the way. Paul knew his horticulture. When you graft in, you take a cultivated branch and put it into a wild stalk. But contrary to nature, God did it this way. He took the cultivated tree, broke off some branches, that's his judgments on Israel,
Yeah.
and warns against being arrogant against the broken off branches. And that is sadly the story of much of Christian history. Which again, I'm not down on the church. I am down on the
Yeah.
disobedience of people like us who have been arrogant against the broken off branches and say, we have replaced you. We are now the planting of God. And when in reality, the planting of God is Israel, and the grafting in is the nations, the non-Jews, the ones that God was going to add in by faith, by grace through faith. And it all fits together. It's a beautiful tree, and it recognizes its root. It honors its father and mother as such, and it will go well with you in the land if you do. That's the promise, one of the promises God made. And so there we have Israel and the church, and this does become a theological tussle between what could be then called replacement theology versus Israelology, which hasn't found its way into the systematic theologies yet, and that's part of the reason we don't have much churchmen getting educated on this.
And doesn't Paul write something to the effect in Romans 11 where he says, what is it? Something like kind of challenging Gentiles to be grateful, in part because room was made for them by the breaking off of the branches.
Yes.
And
that's the mystery.
And I think that would be a good. I just want to highlight. I can understand why why even I would come to the conclusion. Well, therefore, room was made for me. There's limited room, right? Which I think when we stop and really think about that in context with the Lord, I think there's a level of silliness. And I want to highlight what you said as we are kind of merge into what does action look like? How are we being formed by our theologies? That we have to begin with especially just clear scripture, right? So even if we disagree on maybe some of the, because unfortunately, even though there's a lot here, Bill, I would even still say that a lot of it's still communicated through metaphor and analogy, which does lend itself to cultural misinterpretation, especially over 2,000 years. And I'm 2,000 years in a hemisphere separated from the writers of this book, and so I feel like it'd be normal for me to not get what they're saying through certain metaphors. So, but I do want to just bring up one of the things that for me in my personal life has been maybe the big thorn in the side, and maybe the reason I haven't wanted to wrestle with this theology. And I think this will merge us into action. For me, strong Israel theology, so theology that would say that Israel is still special to the Lord, that the Lord still is going to fulfill his promises to the nation of Israel, that they still have a special plan in the future of the kingdom, that's tainted by some other things. There's a strong dispensationalism kind of theology that's often attached to Israel. So for a quick kind of background for individuals listening, dispensational theology would be the theology that there's times and seasons for things, dispensations, and that's where we get, again, not even against that theology, really. I'm just talking about my childhood experiences where that theology also resulted in things like the Left Behind movies, like the teaching that the rapture is going to be this sudden event where we are just, magically taken away, which is a theology that I've come to find I don't really see in the Bible, and we're going to talk more about that on a later episode. But
by the way, Phil, that leaves all the Jews behind, doesn't it? And
it does.
There's no point in us caring about them if they're just okay. But go ahead.
Well, despite the fact that people who kind of push that also would then, and I think this is the interesting thing, they interpret everything that happens with Israel only in the light of what it would bring for the end times, right? Oh, and this is where we get, the nation of Israel was established again, so that's going to be a part of end time events, and there's a long history to why we even think that we're not going to get into now. But I do want to say then the other thing is then people who maybe adhere to this theology, there's a lot of political baggage that comes with it as well that has also made me shy away from it. You could look at whether or not we support the nation of Israel, not just from a theological and doctrinal lens, but from a political lens, right? It is a more GOP conservative, generally, kind of tendency to want to provide from the nation, from the United States, to provide the nation of Israel with defense materials and with political support, and kind of choose them over Palestine. And then you'd see more democratic or progressive trends towards siding with the individuals in Palestine, towards reducing our support for Israel. So we're not even just talking about the theology here. Now I have to handle the political baggage that comes with that. And so this, I think, begins to say, well, what am I really and this is the big question, right? This is really what I'm getting at, because we don't need to resolve all these political issues today. The question I have is, Bill, what am I supposed to think about Israel, and what are the actions that should come from that thinking? Because what I'm seeing politically, doesn't seem to align. And using my thoughts on Israel just to get to the right end times, that doesn't seem right either. So I don't feel like
Mm,
I'm seeing it
yeah.
on a bigger stage done well.
You know, I want to address that, and just before I do, if you'll allow me, Phil, I started a thought earlier that I wanted to finish
Go for it.
on the question of Israel and the church. And the young man who said to me, "Yeah, I'm replacement theology. You better believe it, because I don't want anything replacing Jesus." In other words,
Mm.
he and that what I wanted to say was that's the best argument against everything I'm promoting here today. So I started down that
Mm-hmm.
path. I just wanted to finish it. Let's not let anything replace Jesus. But that doesn't mean we have to enter into the either or paradigm and choose between Jesus or Israel. Come on, take your side. No, no.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus
Yep.
is Israel. He is of Israel. So now the state of Israel is what you're getting at. And remember earlier you said the nation
Yeah.
of Israel. I think you called it a nation again. Well, guess what? A state is a political entity, okay, that
Mm.
is incidental to the gathering of the people. So let's just always keep in mind God is dealing with a nation. He's dealing with the nations. I mean, that is just so Bible. And ultimately, when we get to Revelation, there's no question all 12 tribes of the nation, singular nation that he fashioned, are there, represented. Represented are
Mm-hmm.
all 12 tribes. Those names are on the new city of Jerusalem as well, aren't they? Along with the
Yeah, they
12
are.
apostles. All Jews, 24 Jews you have to along with their names at least. Okay. And and so the nation persists. The state is incidental to a nation that has regathered to a land and has formed a polity by which to govern themselves. And this is what every people have ever done everywhere. And every people have done it imperfectly. Every people
Mm.
show the failing and the brokenness of humanity. The Jews are no different. In fact, we understand the brokenness of the nation, the people Israel, more than anything because we have a whole book addressing it. We have a book addressing all the brokenness, right down to Peter's brokenness when he couldn't handle Jesus actually dying. Okay? We're
Bill, are you
all
saying that I
broken.
can have a certain theology around Israel that doesn't mean that I support the state of Israel, right? Like I theologically understand the importance of the nation of Israel, that I can still believe in the promises that God has for Israel, that I can hold this theological stance and not support the state of Israel.
Oh, yeah, you could. In fact, there's many Jews that don't support the state of Israel, and they are the nation Israel. Now, I want to make a case for
Wow.
the state of Israel, though. I,
Okay.
okay, I've invested myself. I've spent collectively years in the state of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
It is an amazing state. It is misrepresented continually. I mean, now think about it. We've got a media that you're getting your that's your filter.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to choose your media because you can find the media that's accurately reporting. You can find the media that has a narrative that just says it's very simple. It's really since the '67 war. The media narrative before '67 war was the Jews are the oppressed by the Arab dominance in the region. The Muslims, it's really Muslim. It's an Islamic pressure to not allow the infidel to be on the land. And now that's just fundamental. That's not politics. There's the Islamic understanding is the infidel, Christian and Jew, cannot rule over a land that was once conquered for Allah. Okay, okay, you cannot
Mm-hmm.
resolve that unless you can somehow reform Islam, and
Yep.
you won't be anytime soon. So just the presence of a political entity on that land is unacceptable in Islamic. So there's a conflict, and that's the nature
Yep.
of the conflict. I put it on the pressure of Islam, and then it can be responded to poorly by broken humanity, including the Jews, Israel. And so the state of Israel, though, is a state of justice. Look at its founding documents. Look at its open arms to
Mm-hmm.
the local Arab populations. Look at the actual story, and you will find a series of missteps and mistakes within an overall quest for shalom, peace, an overall driving passion for justice, for bettering the world. And in 75 years, that state has begun from being, nobody gave it a chance to survive through its many wars, especially the first one. A Holocaust remnant essentially stood up to 7 Arab armies, and you have one of the most formidable states in the world contributing the technology we're using right now, the agriculture, exporting to the world their understanding and knowledge of how to better medical, biomedical agriculture in regions where people can't grow things. On and on. You actually have an amazing state that deserves to be understood as well as criticized for where it
Hmm.
may well be failing.
Can I process aloud with you, and then you can kind of give me your feedback? And I just moved a bunch, like my producer told me not to. Um, so when I'm thinking about this, and I'm listening to you, and I'm processing, I think what's standing out to me is that as a believer, I should first and foremost that I should acknowledge that there's some mystery in the relationship between the church and the nation of Israel, but that doesn't mean that I'm clueless. I think that I think where I'm coming to is that there is a uniqueness to the nation of Israel that does persist today, and that there are still promises that are unique for the nation of Israel and the covenant that they have with the Lord that persists today, and that I need to ensure that my attitude, and this is I really want, I'm really processing through this. I think everyone out there be listening is what I'm saying, is that we have to come with a serious level of humility when we are thinking about and dealing with the Jewish people as commanded by Paul, that we are not to be haughty, that we are not to be proud, that we are not to think that we know best or better. So I think I'm good there, right? So I think that's step one. My formation in this needs to be a formation of humility. My formation needs to be a formation of understanding there's some mystery I don't have here, but that doesn't mean I need to be ignorant. So I think that's step one. Step two is, and this is really important for me, Bill, we can probably have you back on to talk more about the modern state of Israel and hear a little bit more of your defense. I don't know if I'm fully on that page exactly about, but I do think it's important to not acknowledge and just say, like, it's honorable and kind of amazing, miraculous, maybe even an act of God, I would have to say, for such a nation to be existing 75 years later, right? Obviously with huge support from the West, but still.
Oh,
But I
only
think
a little bit of the West. Most of the
we'll have
West
to talk more about that.
most of the West opposes the state of Israel because they view Israel as an oppressor of the Palestinian.
I
I
guess I
would
was thinking of America as I
Yes,
guess I said the West really.
America is really it. Okay, and then
Okay.
it influences some smaller nations that really stand with Israel, like Guatemala. Okay,
Really?
but not the United Nations, not the EU. Israel
Okay.
always. But here's the deal, and then I know you're trying to get to a question.
No, you're
Um,
good. You're good.
if we actually get the correct narrative, and I'm fully convinced this is the correct narrative, this is the correct story.
Hmm.
Israel is actually the liberator of the Palestinian people. They're their liberator. Their oppressor are their totalitarian Islamists who want to keep them from statehood, actually, until they can obliterate the state of Israel and make one state solution would be one Islamic state, have, fashioned after just what ISIS wants. So you see, Israel is actually resisting something really bad to
Hmm.
make something actually very good for the stateless people called Palestinians. And so they are so unappreciated, so unsung in this. You see, what I'm saying sounds almost like preposterous, right?
Yeah.
Couldn't be, Bill. Actually, it is. Now, they make
I am very
mistakes.
hesitant over here.
Every
I'm not ready to jump on this, by the way. So,
every mistake they make in the process is what the news is. What they're actually
yeah.
doing at the sacrifice of their own blood, believe me, Phil, day to day, is
Yeah.
actually providing for a protection and a liberation of the Palestinian people. And it's astounding what they've actually accomplished, but they just don't get
Well,
that recognition.
and I think that's the thing is there Okay, so this is maybe where the crux even of when we talk about modern day Israel, I think that I get at is, the actions of Israel and every other nation on earth. Okay, I just want that noted. So it's not just Israel. I'm not picking on Israel, but every other nation on earth does not align with the actions of Christ, right? Like, we are not seeing nationally any nation loving thy neighbor to the point of sacrifice, willing to adhere abuse and forgive. Not generally, right? And for the record, I know there might be some exceptions, but I'm talking general trends, and Israel falls into that, right? Um,
Every nation,
I
every
think
state, and
every state. And so
and look at our own church. How much do we have to try to keep teaching
I
ourselves
know,
to
I know.
live like
The church
Jesus?
does not do this well either.
So it's
I
all
think,
It's all broken humanity is what we're trying to work with here.
but that makes me cautious about, aligning myself deeply with any nation state, and this could be a bigger conversation that we can even have about, I live in the United States, and so this could be a bigger conversation about how I relate to my own nation. And so if I'm having complexities and difficulties relating to my own nation state and when it does not act like Christ, how much more am I not ready to partner with a foreign nation state that also has deep doctrinal implications that I'm still kind of struggling with and wrestling with? So,
It's just different. Go anywhere, you see the real thing. It's going to be different, but it's incident again. I'll leave you with that thought. It's the state as a polity and its pluses and its minuses is incidental to a people, a nation. And by the way, get among that people and find the people that Jesus says, I've not found such great faith, as in Israel when he says of Gentiles. Well, now you can say it about Jews too. I've not found such great faith in the church. It seems you are so close to the kingdom. There's a move of God among the Jewish people that is happening in the nation, and it manifests in many ways in the attempts of a state to be a just, productive, contributing part of the world, and that works out in many many positive ways. But it won't work out positively in the realm of conflict because the conflict is unsolvable. In fact, maybe the biggest question of all this, and you've been really asking it, Phil, is what's the result? How should we live? What makes a difference if we get Israel right? And I would say that if we used a quick analogy, God has so beautifully designed the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is really what we're wanting to be. We're wanting to live and proclaim and follow that message. We don't have to have Israel right to do that. So good news. We're not sitting here saying if you don't get Israel right, you're not saved, or you're not, you can't preach the gospel. But sometimes because of that very reality, we think we don't need to understand Israel. We can ignore Israel when Paul again says, "Don't ignore." He says, "Don't be arrogant," because the church suffers. We've suffered for centuries through a cursing posture towards Israel instead of a blessing, and there's the opportunity. God's promise really is true for all the nations that if we'll bless, He will bless, and that's not to get stuff. That's to have His favor for what he would have us do. And what we're to do is to propagate the gospel and make disciples. And the Puritans particularly made a contribution to bring an understanding of Israel back to the church. It's fascinating. Look at Jonathan Edwards. Look at the Puritans. They were looking at their Bibles and going, my, we should be blessing Israel, and we've been cursing them. So there you go. This is an opportunity for every believer, every Christian, every follower of Jesus to be a blesser and not a curser. So the more we can just find out
mm,
about how to bless the nation, the people, and so much of it is just in our prayer and our heart attitude. Let's be ones who pray for the peace of Jerusalem, who pray for the
yeah,
salvation of Israel, who actually care enough to intercede on behalf of this people instead of just maybe sizing them up and critiquing them and dismissing them. For some reason, we want to do that. For some reason, we want to do that. Instead, what if we bless and see what
yeah.
God will do, not only in our life, but in this full outworking of the propagation of the gospel and making of disciples. And ultimately, it all comes back, and here we have a land and a people again. It comes back to a place called Jerusalem, where Jesus said, "You will not see me again until you say," and the words in Hebrew sounded like this, Baruch haba Bashem Adonai. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. When you when you say, he's very specific. He speaks to Jerusalem. So we're anticipating the day, and we don't understand. I don't want to predict the future, except where Jesus spoke
Yeah.
of the future. He said, "You'll see me again when you say." And when he ascended from the Mount of Olives, the angel said, "You'll see him return as you saw him go." And that's intended fulfillment and from Ezekiel's prophecy. So I don't major on prophecy except to say a blessing church gets to be a part of the ultimate calling of him home.
Yeah.
And we're always to be in our prayer calling him home. And so ultimately, it is that people on that land
Amen.
who say, "Come home." And then it's all done at that point. New heaven, New Jerusalem. I'm a part of that. I want to be a part of that and encourage others to pray, propagate the gospel, and bless Israel as part of that overall plan of God. Thank you, Phil.
Bill, thank you so much, and I'm grateful. I'm kind of thinking as you were speaking, and now that you feel like you've freed me up, that I don't feel like I have to only bless Israel, but like there's an and component, right? That I can bless the church and Israel and the people the Lord has put in front of me, and I don't know why it took me so long to be able to get over that. Thank you for your time, Bill.
Thank you, Phil. God bless you and all who are tuned in with us.
God bless. You have been listening to the Living Room Disciple podcast, and we are glad that you are here. Throughout the month of March, we are excited to introduce you and others to this brand new endeavor. However, we will be taking the month of April off, so please make sure to subscribe to this podcast so that way you'll hear us in your feeds in May. In fact, we're taking the month off to figure out how to do this even better. There's a survey that we'd love for you to take in the show notes to give us feedback. And also, don't forget to rate the pod. Throughout the month of March, Nick and myself are excited to bring you 5 different conversations. 3 of them will be between Nick and myself talking about spiritual formation around things like hell and damnation and the idea of living room discipleship. The other 2 weeks, we'll each be interviewing people who are deeply formative for us, and we're excited to introduce you to them. Huge shout out to our production staff, Anissa Live, and to our marketing manager, Eric Church. Thank you so much for all the work you do. This is a production of the Living Room Disciple Media, and we're glad you're here.